Today's gospel lesson comes from Matthew chapter 13. These are a series of parables that Jesus told his disciples. Jesus said, "The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed that someone took and sowed in his field. It is the smallest of all seeds, but when it has grown, it is the greatest of all shrubs and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches." Jesus told them another parable. "The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed in with 3 measures of flour until all of it was leavened. The kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field, which someone found and hid. Then in his joy, the man sells all he has and buys that field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search of fine pearls. On finding one pearl of great value, he went and sold all that he had and bought it." This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
So I is for imagination. Imagination, that facultiness, it conjures up new patterns, new possibilities, new stories, so that we start to see everyday life differently. It becomes more interesting, more intriguing, more surprising. We look for patterns all the time. It's part of our imaginative gift that God gives us. I remember a few weeks ago down by the bay, Danielle and I, we walk out on Kilchus Point, and we go out toward the bay, and sometimes we sit or stand by this big log that's right near the edge. And so we were standing there for a while looking at the birds out on the water, and then I looked to my right and I saw coming out of a knot a dragon's head. Obviously someone else had seen this pattern before, because it seems like they did a little bit of carving to carve out the nostrils a little bit more, and the eyes and the ears, and even somehow colored them in a little bit. So here was this dragon staring at us. I don't know how long it had been there. So imagination does that. It looks for patterns to discover and to play with. You know, when you're outside, you're looking at the beautiful cloudy sky and these big billowy clouds, you see patterns in them, you see certain creatures, various kinds of animals, and if you're with a friend, you start saying, well, I see, a bird over there, well, there's a rabbit, and no, I don't see that as a rabbit, I see that as a hippopotamus. So people begin to use their imagination to figure out these patterns. We look up in the sky for these things, but we also look on the ground for interesting signs and artifacts that we might be able to make something out. Now, one of the things that Danielle likes to do when we're down by the bay is that she looks for heart-shaped rocks. So she'll spend half her time looking at the beautiful scenery and the other half of her time looking down at the rocks, at the bay. And usually she'll find a handful of heart-shaped rocks. Now some of these, seems to be a bit of a stretch. Some of them look like really, cool heart-shaped rocks. Others become maybe increasingly abstract or, suggesting a rock perhaps. But when you have them with the other rocks, it kind of shows why that particular rock was selected. So anyway, before we leave, Daniel likes to kind of stage these rocks in a place where someone is going to see them when they come down the trail, and then they can have their imaginative encounter with these heart-shaped rocks. Maybe it will mean something to them. Maybe it will be a signal of God's love, or just a kind of encouragement of playfulness and imagination. Now, a while back, Daniel and I were taking a walk in the neighborhood. This was like several years ago. And we came across this simple little house and an interesting front yard. The front yard had a small tree and a small bush out in front. And but what was interesting is that this tree, much of the time, did not have leaves on it, and the bush just kind of stuck up in the ground with these leafless branches. But stuck on the end of many of these branches was these just beautiful indigo blue bottles stuck on the end. So, you know, in sunlight, it was just kind of an amazing picture. It was just very beautiful and strangely appropriate, but something I never would have thought of. So, what I like about just our everyday, ordinary human capacity for imagination is that it can take some simple things, some random things, some ambiguous things, some broken things, and make them into something wonderful, something funny, or something beautiful or surprising. Suddenly, you have a dragon staring back at you, or maybe you have a handful of hearts that are going to encourage you that day. Now, this is something people do all the time. We have people in our congregation who love to exercise their imagination. You know, maybe you've heard of Kathy Lou Reams. She took this old, cracked, chipped flower pot and turned it into this very engaging character, a head that she's named Lucy. We have Ed Jones, who he likes to pick up these odds and ends of driftwood on the beach, takes them to his shop, and he walks out with these unique walking sticks. Karen Allenbrand, she likes to go to rummage sales and garage sales, and she collects all sorts of odds and ends that if you were to look at them piled up there, you might not think they really add up to anything. That is until you go downstairs for fellowship time and you see these amazing, you know, beautiful, whimsical table decorations. People use their imagination with just the simple things around them. So it doesn't have to be things either. You don't have to be exercising your imagination in terms of things. You can be the way you share a good joke, or an especially bad pun that leaves people groaning. Or, you know, sometimes you're whistling a tune and it's not anything that you've heard anywhere, it's just something you're making up on the spot. Danielle and I often like to listen to music on the radio, and then we make up different lyrics for the song. Silly, you know, dumb lyrics, but it's our exercise in imagination and creativity. Even the simplest act of imagination, it enriches your experience of the world. It gets you looking for things that will surprise you and engage you. It enriches our gatherings together. It helps us to see the world differently. Imagination is essential for human life. It's essential for giving us a sense of hope and possibility. Imagination opens up dimensions of reality that we had not previously noticed. A young 16-year-old man, a man when he was 16 years old, before he showed any promise to the world, he did something strange, a strange act of imagination. He imagined what it would be like, how things would appear around him if he rode on a beam of light. Of course, we're talking about Albert Einstein. At age 16, he's applying that imagination in a thought experiment, and later that thought experiment unfolded into a revolution for modern physics and modern science. Back in the 19th century, a German chemist was having a tough time trying to understand the chemical structure of carbon. And who wouldn't? Who does? None of us here do. But no one had understood this at this time in the 19th century. So he's been racking his brain about this, and as he's riding home in a carriage, he starts daydreaming, and he kind of drifts off into a reverie, and he sees these atoms jumping around and dancing in a pattern. And pretty soon they form this line. Maybe it's like a conga line. I don't know if they have that in England or in Germany. But he sees them form this interesting kind of chain. Well, when he got home, later in that evening, he started diagramming out the pattern of these atoms, and it turns out that he has just discovered how carbon bonds in chemical structures. Now, I don't know what that means, but it's pretty impressive, right?
Right.
Use your imagination. Then the professor later said to his fellow scientists, "Let us learn to dream, gentlemen. Then perhaps we shall learn the truth. But let us beware of publishing our dreams until they have been tested by our waking understanding. So yes, we don't want to have our heads in the clouds, but imagination can help us understand things on the ground pretty well. Often it gives us foreshadowings and symbols and blurry first draft sketches of future possibilities. Another example, the sci-fi series Star Trek. Remember that?
Yeah.
Now we kind of look back and it's kind of hokey in some ways, but in the 1960s, remember they had this small handheld device called a communicator, and they could speak to others, thousands of miles away. Nowadays we call that a cell phone. Right? Lieutenant Uhura, the communications officer. Yes, she was beautiful, but she also was the first person to operate a Bluetooth earpiece. Remember that? She had that in her ear. More important than that, she was a cultural pioneer, picturing women as strong and intelligent and part of the top command structure of that ship. Woman who played that role, Nichelle Nichols, she inspired thousands of women, especially African Americans, to defy the stereotypes and begin to pursue careers in science. Major impact on society. She heard from thousands of people that she had inspired. So imagination sees things, not just fantastical things, but it sees potential and reality. There are powers and possibilities that are below the surface. They're lying dormant until we can notice them and activate them. So we need the right kind of surprising stories and images and ideas to stir them up and get them going. Now, the first reading, Revelation 22, had some very beautiful and powerful image about what the world would look like if it was healed of violence and sin and death. You have the river of life flowing from the throne right down the middle of the street. So you have this very sublime image combined with the pedestrian image of a street. You have the tree of life. It's growing on both sides of this bank. There's an endless day there. There's no longer a sun or a moon. God is the source of this light, inspiring vision for everyone that lives there. See, images like that get us longing for something more, something better, for the thing that God can bring about. But of course, the most imaginative teacher of the Bible is Jesus. It says that Jesus taught all the time in parables. He taught constantly in parables. That was his main mode of communication. Parables are like extended metaphors. They're extremely short stories. They kind of extend a metaphor or a symbol, and they show us in this kind of indirect and creative way, this kind of suggestive way, what God's liberating and life-giving kingdom is like. So Jesus uses ordinary things in extraordinary ways. Tiny mustard seed. Now, a mustard seed, or in case you did not know this, does not grow into a tree. It grows into a bush. Maybe a big bush, but not a tree. Okay? So, but in Jesus' parable, it becomes a gigantic redwood. Then you have the idea that God's kingdom, we think God's kingdom, a great, magnificent kingdom. But Jesus tells parables that show the kingdom as being something that's hidden, that's hard to find, and you have to suss it out. So these are kind of strange, quirky, imaginative ways that Jesus gets us to look for patterns and opportunities that are hidden in plain sight. We need something that jolts us out of our usual frame of reference. So, the first parable, it addresses this sense, our customary idea of God's kingdom operation. It's a massive display of shock and awe where God's power rolls over the opposition. That would be a kingdom worthy of God. That's the pretty much the standard party line of first century Judaism. Power and victory, purity and infinite justice. So, You can see how Jesus is subverting this idea with the kingdom is like teeny tiny mustard seed. He says, look below the radar. Don't look for a massive, giant, public works program. Look for tiny mustard seed-sized opportunities in daily life. Look for little heart-shaped rocks. Look for the small, unexpected thing. Simple things like acts of compassion, basic relationships, people at the margins. Jesus is saying that's where the kingdom starts to grow into something big. Use your imagination. Look for those kinds of things. Second parable. Yeast. It's like, a woman takes a little bit of yeast, works it into a big blob of dough, and it expands and expands. It's a lot of dough and a lot of yeast. It's an unnatural amount of yeast that's being used there. So you can imagine the thing's going to explode, get really huge, like some weird episode of I Love Lucy, where things just get out of hand. It's that kind of a deal. So Jesus is saying, look for the ways God's kingdom is going to spread among those who are different, who are not pure, who don't color inside the lines. Why? Because yeast is unclean in first century Judaism. It's unclean. So it's not something, that's why they had unleavened bread. So to use this rather unusual image of uncleanness, Jesus is saying, imagine my kingdom is spreading like yeast. It's expanding to the whole community through these kind of unlikely people, people who are not pure, people who don't color inside the lines, people who are different. The third parable, God's kingdom is like a treasure hidden in a field. Now, kingdom seems like a pretty big deal. It's a big image. So, something hidden in a field, that's a rather striking contrast. And not only that, you have to pour some time and money. You have to buy this field. You find it, and then you have to dig it up. So the kingdom requires, some persistent pursuit, some effort and participation to uncover it. This is a different kind of kingdom. Use your imagination to look for that kind of kingdom. Kingdom in the fourth parable is like the one pearl that's worth more than all the others. So you have this image of a merchant who's sifting through all of these pearls, many pearls. He's trying to find the one pearl of great price. So the kingdom is a very valuable and important thing, but it's competing with other values and other beautiful things. There are all sorts of good things that we believe in and that we enjoy and that we support with all of our loyalty. But the kingdom of God is worth more than all of those things and should not be confused with any of those other things. It's worth more than all of them put together. So we treasure many things, but there is one treasure that enriches everyone, that makes all of life worthwhile. One treasure that if you don't have it, nothing is worth having. That's the kingdom of God. Only the creating and redeeming Spirit of God that is breathing into everyday life, breathing into each person, only that Spirit, only connecting with God's Spirit, walking in step with that Spirit can save us. Jesus is trying to wake us up to that transforming power. He wants to wake us up so we can see how rocks can become hearts expressing love. How a dried up piece of driftwood can suddenly be a magical creature looking straight at you. God is in the world, in our lives, there to change things and open our eyes and our imagination. But we have to look. We have to participate. We have to join in. The world comes to life when we use our imagination. The Bible talks about rocks praising God and about the trees of the field clapping their hands. But that's for those with imagination, with eyes to see. Simple objects can do extraordinary things if we can imagine the possibilities. In fact, even vegetables can make music and praise God. Even carrots. Exhibit A. Perhaps this cloth represents the soil in which vegetables can grow. But now we're ready to watch a video.
Now it says no signal.
So use your imagination. What will this be about?
There are two other vegetable orchestras out there in the world, but what we've done a little different is that we've been trying to make all our instruments in one particular key. We're striving to be a perfect 440 orchestra. We have to learn how to preserve them. So I would say the most I can get out of the best instrument is about a week. There are some instruments that will last a few hours, and most of them will give me at least 2 days. We make sure that everything gets reused back into the earth in any way possible. One of the really rewarding parts of the vegetable orchestra is when we do our fairs, we have the little kids come up. They're always so interested in exploring what's on the table. That wow aspect, that the thing works and it sounds good, and that's really rewarding to see.
Well, that's kind of a good intro to, we're going to have a creativity series starting in the fall. And one of them, Danielle, is going to do fun with food. Not necessarily musical instruments, but just, decorative things you can do with food. But it does kind of give you this sense for how everyday things have unusual possibilities. Things that I would never have thought of creating an orchestra out of vegetables. I would never have thought of turning a carrot into a flute. But if you have imagination, there are possibilities that all of a sudden can appear that can enrich our lives. So be on the watch for our announcements about the Creativity Series. That's kind of still in the planning stage. But in the meantime, remember to use your imagination. It's a God-given faculty. It is one of the gifts of the Spirit. It is God's creative and imaginative way of getting us on board to renew the world. So remember to be part of the kingdom. God's calling you to contribute your compassion and your creativity. And when you do,